My name is Enrique Pintado. I am a lawyer. I've been working in the tax administration during almost 22 years. Currently, I am the chief counsel of the Peruvian tax administration. I've also been part of the delegation for the negotiation of double taxation agreements, the Peruvian delegation.
I started as a tax treaty negotiator for Canada in the late 1980s. I joined the OECD, which is an international organization that deals with various issues, including tax issues, at the beginning of the 90s to work on tax treaties for them until 2017, when I joined the UN Secretariat, where I continued to do work on tax treaties, including capacity building for developing countries until roughly 2021.
I'm Daniel Muley, policy lead with Oxfam, based in Washington, D.C., and I focus on the taxation of extractive industries.
An offshore indirect transfer is a way to try to avoid such taxation by transferring the assets. If you sold it directly, you'd be taxed in the country where it's located. So what you do is you transfer the assets into a vehicle, such as a company, located in a country that is not the same as where the property is located. And then you sell the shares of that company or other vehicle in order to indirectly transfer the assets that it owns.
The way in which this happens often is when the asset that is transferred is actually transferred outside of the source country that would typically have the right to tax that. And so we call it an OIT, an offshore indirect transfer.
So to give you an example, if I had land in Nigeria and I wanted to sell that land, I might be taxed by Nigeria on the capital gain. So what I would do is I would set up a company, let's mention a country, Luxembourg, and I would initially transfer the land to that company at a time, maybe just after the acquisition, when there's not a big capital gain. And later, if the assets, the land in Nigeria, increases in value, I would not sell it because I don't want to pay the capital gain tax in Nigeria. I would sell the shares of the company in Luxembourg. That's an offshore indirect transfer.
So in this way, if the resident of country A wants to sell the asset in country B, it only has to sell or alienate the shares of the company, the offshore company. So the indirect offshore transfers is a way to avoid tax in the source country.
This area is of particular concern for us, given the prevalence of the issue in the mining, oil, and gas sector. At the heart of the transfers that end up taking place indirectly and offshore, and thus avoid capital gains taxation. Developing countries in particular are missing out on huge sums that can be spent on things like healthcare and education.
It's agreed by everyone that the right to tax on a direct sale of the asset would belong to the country where the asset is located. But through tax planning, the taxpayer avoids that tax by selling what is equivalent to the ownership of these assets, which is the ownership of shares of an entity, the only assets of which represent the assets located in the country that would want to tax.
The main problem in developing countries is the lack of this anti-avoidance rule. So after many years, countries such as Peru, Chile, Colombia have passed laws in this regard, but there are other countries that do not have.
For tax administrations of developing countries, of course, it's a lot more important because tax revenues are essential for their growth and for meeting the agenda in terms of sustainable development.
Developing countries need to have a suite of legal tools at their disposal to be able to tackle the problem of offshore indirect transfers and effectively tax the capital gains that result from that.
The Joint Secretariat of the UN, the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank produced a toolkit on offshore indirect transfer that basically described various ways of addressing the issue. The UN, since 1980, always had a provision on allowing taxation of some indirect offshore transfers of land. That provision, however, over the years evolved.
2021 updates to the UN Model Tax Agreement between developed and developing countries make some important strides on addressing capital gains taxation of offshore indirect transfers.
In 2021, we've extended to offshore indirect transfers not only of land, but also of certain assets, which are assets such as cell phone licenses. And then we've improved the rule that was already there by saying it also applies anytime you have an indirect transfer of property that is land, but also any of those types of rights and any combination of them.
Article 7 also goes further beyond updates from the 2017 model to further ensure that there are opportunities to tax offshore indirect transfers, even where the transfers themselves happen in a third country beyond the two signatory parties.
How confident are you that you will be able to enforce the provision? You need to include that provision in your tax treaties. So that means you either have to negotiate new treaties or negotiate amendment to your existing treaties so that the provisions become applicable.
Not many countries have these offshore indirect transfers as in their internal laws. I think the most important thing is that countries that do not include that in their internal law should realize about this problem and include it.
Developing countries should definitely consider integrating the new UN model's guidance on indirect offshore transfers in their negotiation of tax treaties, in part because it's a way in which they can better protect their rights to tax in this particularly critical area of taxation. So the UN model's guidance will be very helpful in countries that are looking to do just that.